Hey everyone, so today's video is going to be about heart failure. Heart failure is extremely interesting from a lot of different perspectives. One, it's a very prominent condition, so it's really important that healthcare professionals understand what it is and how to deal with it. But from a medical perspective, it's particularly interesting because we're talking about the failure of the cardiovascular system, which is sort of the engine that drives the entire body. If your heart's not working correctly, then the rest of your body is not going to be able to get the oxygen that it needs, and it's not going to be able to get rid of the waste products that are produced when the body is carrying out its day-to-day functions, okay? So we're talking about a pretty bad backup that can cause a lot of problems in a lot of different organ systems. So it's important that we understand how to manage this sort of condition and why it's happening. Okay, so before we really get started on heart failure, let's talk about the circulatory system in general for a second. I want us to all be, reading from the same book, as it were, and then we can sort of talk about what heart failure is. Okay, so let's start at the right atrium. Okay, the right atrium is where blood that's coming back from the body, from the tissues, first encounters the heart. Okay, so it's this little chamber. It's going to fill up with deoxygenated blood, with basically spent blood, whose oxygen content is really low. Okay, it's going to fill up and it's going to contract and it's going to push through this little valve here into the right ventricle. Okay, that right ventricle is going to fill up, and when it contracts, it's going to push blood up through this next valve and into what we call the pulmonary circuit. Okay, pulmonary meaning having to do with the lungs. Okay, what happens is the blood is going to have to move up to the lungs because this is where we're going to get rid of our CO2, right, our waste product, and this is where we're going to get more oxygen, right, oxygen being this fuel that our body needs in order to make energy. Okay, so we're going to move up through the arteries, into the arterioles, and finally into the capillaries. So the capillaries are these very, very narrow, thin blood vessels where gas exchange can happen. They're thin enough that gases can move back and forth, okay? And the lungs are made up of these large tubes that branch and branch like a root system until they end up at these tiny little air sacs, and these air sacs are called alveoli. Okay, the alveoli are surrounded by capillaries. You can sort of see in this picture there's some indication of how surrounded they are, but the important point is they're connected. Okay, gas exchange can happen between the alveoli and the capillaries, and that's vital. We need to get rid of our waste and get our oxygen. Okay, so once that blood has been oxygenated, once it's been fortified with oxygen, it's going to make its way back to the heart, and it's going to first encounter the heart in the left atrium. Okay, similar to the right atrium, this is where blood comes back. It collects in the chamber contracts, and then blood is pushed down into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle, when it contracts, it's going to push blood instead into the systemic circuit, which is just a fancy way of saying the rest of the body. Okay, the systemic circuit includes, all of your muscles, all of your organ systems, everything. All right, so blood that has oxygen in it is going to be pushed out and make its way into the body so that it can start giving out oxygen where oxygen is needed. Okay, and then what's going to happen is once that oxygen has been given up and the blood is again sort of oxygen poor, it's going to make its way back and start the whole cycle again. Okay, so that's a brief, fast and furious overview of the general principles of the cardiovascular system. So now let's talk about what happens when this system goes awry. All right, this is what we're going to talk about in heart failure. So first thing we want to do, have to make the point that a heart attack and heart failure are not the same thing. Okay, heart failure has to do with the heart not being able to meet the energy demands of the body. Okay, something's wrong with the pump. Something is wrong somewhere in the system so that the body is not getting the energy that it needs. Okay, but a heart attack is when the muscle cells that line the heart, that actually provide the force of contraction, when they die. And when they die, you experience a heart attack. Okay, so it's different. A heart attack can cause cell death that will end up making the heart not work as well. And when that happens, you can get heart failure, okay? A heart attack can lead to heart failure, but not vice versa, okay? They are different things. All right, so now that we understand the difference, let's talk about a couple of different types of heart failure. So the first one is much more rare. It's known as high output cardiac failure. You have to forgive my penmanship slightly. High output, okay? So high output is when there's actually nothing wrong with the heart. It's just that there's so much blood moving through the system and there's so much demand by the body for energy that the body can't keep up, okay? So it's like you're driving a Ford Focus, which we all know is going to top out at 85, and you're chasing a Lamborghini, which does 85 in its sleep. Okay, at some point, your Ford Focus is just going to not be able to go any faster, okay? There's nothing wrong with the engine. It's just that that's its limit. That's what happens in high output heart failure. You have so much in the system that the heart just can't keep up. This happens with blood transfusions or serum transfusions, okay? And it's important to make the distinction that high output heart failure is not some sort of passing thing. So you're not going to get it if you run for too long on the treadmill, okay? So if you're working out with a buddy and you say, oh, I can't work out anymore, I'm experiencing a little minor high output heart failure, okay? Make sure that friend calls you out, because that's not what's going on. High output heart failure will actually present with the symptoms of heart failure. It's just happening for a different reason, okay? So don't be lame in the gym. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, the other type of heart failure, which is way more common, is what's called congestive heart failure. All right, so congestive heart failure is when there is a problem with the heart. Something has gone wrong, okay? And there are a lot of different ways that the heart can malfunction, okay? So the first thing we want to talk about is the myocardial tissue that surrounds the heart, right? This muscle down here. Okay, so let's scroll down. Okay, so this area here, all right, all of this muscle is vital to the heart contracting. And if it fails or if it gets weak, then you can start having improper contractions, or you can have a contraction of the ventricle that's not strong enough to get enough blood out into the systemic circuit, right, out into the body. And this can also happen over here. If you don't have enough blood getting up into the pulmonary circuit, then you're not going to have enough fresh oxygenated blood to circulate through the body. Okay, so this is problematic. So another way that this could happen, that congestive heart failure could come on, is if you have improper oxygen supply to the muscle itself. Okay, so this is kind of like what we were talking about when we were discussing a heart attack. You can have narrowing of the veins that supply the heart with blood, so that you're not getting enough oxygen to the heart muscles themselves, in which case they're not going to be able to function as well as they could if they had all the fuel that they needed. Okay, so this is another type. This is what atherosclerosis, people who have hardening of the arteries, people who have long-term coronary problems often are dealing with narrow arteries, which makes their heart not work as well. Okay, you could also have valve problems. So these valves that connect the atrium and the ventricle are hugely important. You can imagine, say that this valve here narrows. Say that it's not going to let enough blood get into the ventricle. Well, that's a problem, because that ventricle is still going to fire. It's still going to contract, but it's not going to have enough blood to push up into the pulmonary circuit. Or the same thing could happen over here in the left ventricle. If this valve narrows, you're not going to get enough blood that comes down in here. This isn't going to fill, and you're not going to have enough blood moving into the body. Okay, so you can have valve problems that decrease the amount of blood moving through the circulatory system that can cause problems. The last thing I want to touch on is problems with the electrical system. So what happens, just like in your car engine, the heart has to fire in coordination. It has a lot of moving parts, and those moving parts have to fire correctly in order for the heart to work well. So in your car, you have pistons that are firing in alternating order so that there's always a piston firing, right? You want a fire and then a fire and then a fire. You don't want two pistons firing at once and then none the next interval. Okay, that's very inefficient. All right, so the heart similarly has to be coordinated. So what happens usually is the atrium contracts, pushes blood down into the ventricle. There's a little bit of a rest, and then the ventricle contracts to push blood out into the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit. Okay, if that system is thrown off, if the electrical coordination is not correct, then you can have a whole series of problems. You can have the ventricle firing too soon. You can have the atrium not pumping enough blood into the ventricle. There are a lot of ways that the heart can be impacted if the electrical system is not working correctly. Okay, so that's a fast and furious overview of the cardiovascular system and a pretty good introduction to the different kinds of heart failure and how heart failure can come about, some general categories of things can go wrong.